A thumbs up and a smile to make sure that everyone can hear me. Okay, looking good so far. So welcome back to our weekly English speaking virtual tasting. As those of you who are regular attendees will know, the idea is to explore a wine using the WSET systematic approach to tasting for the level 2 and level 3. We're trying to really connect the things that we know about the wine, the theory behind the wine, with what we're going to taste in the glass. Before I start today, I do have a couple of announcements. First of all, myself, Jacopo, and our colleagues Lan and Laika have written a book. So for those of you who don't follow us on social media, we've written a book, The Jumbo Shrimp Guide to Italian Wine. Please, please, please follow the Instagram account for Italian Wine Book. Go take a look, see what we've done, find out where you can order your copy, because I know you're going to want one. It's fantastic illustrations by our colleague Sylvia, and put together under Andrea, our head of editorial. So I just wanted to give a shout out because we're incredibly proud. So a little bit of shameless self-promotion. The other thing is related to WSET, because as you'll be aware, things are opening up, the exams are coming up, we are arranging for the exams to happen here in Verona. And I wanted to draw your attention to something, specifically, like most importantly for those of you doing the level 3, okay? And that's a document called the WSET specification, okay? You should all have a copy of this. If you don't, please go and get one, okay? You can just put in WSET level 3 or level 2 specification into Google, okay? This is the best tool you have for helping you pass the exam, because it tells you specifically where you should focus your attention, okay? It gives you exactly what you need. And even more specifically, let me find the page for you, okay? There is a page 27 in the level 3 specification, and there is exactly the same style of page in the level 2 specification, which literally tells you the breakdown of the questions. So it tells you how many questions there will be, for example, on grape growing and climate, how many questions there will be on production techniques, okay? This is a really great tool, and I think educators don't talk about it enough as a place for students to get the best possible information about the exams. The same thing exists for your level 2 exam. If you want to know how many questions there are going to be on food pairing, for example, this document will tell you. So I just wanted to give that piece of information before we start tasting the wine, so that you can make sure you can go out, get it, and you've got plenty of time before your exams coming up in the next month to make yourself familiar. Okay, so let's dive into the wine. Last week we were tasting the Garganega IGT from the Veneto by Massimago. This week we're going to shift our focus to Massimago's Valpolicella DOC. Okay, this is their 2018. And as usual, a little bit of background about the wine. The first thing to mention is that this is the first blended wine that we've tasted in our virtual tasting, which is quite interesting. We've been doing a lot of focus, obviously, on those single varietals. But it is nice to taste a blended wine, particularly having tasted so many single varietals, just so that we can begin to consider this question of why you blend. I mean, this is often a very important question in exams, both level 2 and level 3. Why do you blend different grapes together? Okay. Now, for those of you doing the tasting exam level 3, there is not going to be a question in the tasting exam that asks you to name the grapes in the blend. And particularly for your Valpolicella, all you need to know is that it is Corvina led, okay, that the main grape is Corvina. So that's what you actually have to know. But obviously, when we're thinking about our theory, we do need to consider why we're blending grapes together. Okay. So the Massimago Valpolicella is a blend of Corvina, Corvinone, and Rondinella. Okay? And I'm going to talk a little bit about those grapes later. Okay? So this is, again, organic. Okay? We talked a little bit about the problems, the issues you might have with organic production, this idea of needing to be very careful, particularly in the Veneto, with issues of damp and rot. Okay? So again, we're seeing use of the pergola training system, this Veronese pergola quite high above the ground. Okay. However, there is also some Gio training system, some VSP, so trained on stakes and wires, and that's being used particularly for the Corvinone and Rondinella. Again, I'm going to talk about this when we talk about the grapes. Okay. Grown on clay limestone soils. Now, with this wine, I found that it's not really so much the site, the aspects, the natural aspects that are at play in the wine. It's more about the production and the grape varieties. Okay. So in terms of production, we have cold soak for 4 days. Okay. So you're doing some extra maceration at a cooler temperature, and this is going to give you some increased color potentially, and potentially some increased structure. Okay. Then the wine is aged in stainless steel for 6 months on the lees. Now again, whilst this normally is not something we talk about a lot in red wine, because we're not going to see the lees flavors come out. When we talk about lees, we're particularly tending to talk about these yeasty dairy notes. You don't see that expressed in the red wines because of everything else that's going on in them. The tannins, everything else tends to mask this, and it's unusual to have a lot of lees aging. But the thing we need to also consider is the impact of lees on texture. Okay. This is what we're going to be talking about this wine, is does that period of lees aging aid the texture of this wine? Okay. So in terms of our expectations, I really do want to think about the grape varieties in a little bit of detail, because it's also relevant to the production. Okay. So your main grape variety is Corvina, thick skins, but only moderate color. And for those of you who have read the WSET level 3 book, there is a mistake in the book. The WSET level 3 book says that Corvina has thin skins. Okay, this is incorrect. WSET are aware, but it has thick skins, making it suitable for the drying that you see in Amarone and Recioto, but it does only have this moderate color and low to moderate tannins. Okay. It's a high acid grape, expresses normally cherry, maybe light blackberry, raspberry, and also a slight floral character, kind of violet. But some interesting things about Corvina, it's disease prone. Okay, so it's prone to rot and fungal diseases. It's also because of the nature of the skins, whilst they're thick, they don't like the sun. They tend to burn very easily. So this is why you're finding Corvina grown on that pergola system. Okay, high above the ground, away from that moisture as much as possible, and protected by the canopy from the sun. Okay. It also struggles to ripen. In particular, it struggles to reach sugar ripeness, okay, which is the thing that gives you the potential for alcohol, and obviously means that it maintains this high acidity. This is why Corvina is blended with Rondinella and Corvinone. In particular, Rondinella accumulates sugar very quickly. Okay? So this is the grape that you use if you want to add a little bit more alcohol potential during your fermentation. Remember that the amount of available sugar you have in your grapes is directly correlated to how much alcohol you will have at the end. Okay? Rondinella in terms of flavor is also one of what I call the seasoning grapes. Okay? It adds a herbal character. It's a little bit like sprinkling a little bit of salt and pepper on your food. It just adds and rounds out the character of the wine, adding this extra dimension. Okay? Corvinone, on the other hand, is more tannic with a very strong cherry character. So if you're trying to get these bright, fresh, cherry-led wines, but you want a little bit more tannin than you have with Corvina, Corvinone is the grape that you would add to your blend. So these are things to be thinking about when we taste the wine, because I really do think you are getting a true understanding of how grapes blend together in this wine. Okay. In terms of how winemaking will affect the wine, steel, no oak at any point. So we're going to be looking for freshness and bright color. Okay. We're not going to be looking for those secondary characteristics of winemaking. Remember, primary characteristics are coming from the grape, secondary characteristics are coming from winemaking, and tertiary characteristics are coming from aging. Okay. We have nothing in the winemaking that will really impact the wine except perhaps adding a little bit of texture or structure. Okay. There's no extra flavor that should be added by winemaking. And obviously it's a 2018, it's relatively young, we shouldn't see the impact of aging. And finally, thinking about the cold soak, maybe thinking about getting a little bit more texture and color. Okay, so let's dive in. I hope you all have a glass. One thing I love about this wine is it finally gives you an opportunity to see what a truly pale ruby wine is. There's absolutely no arguing. You can see all the way through, right down to the base. I could read a book through this wine. Okay, so this is your classic example of a pale ruby. And that's what it should be, yeah? Okay. So in terms of intensity, okay, this is actually medium plus intensity for your level 3, which means medium for your level 2. I find that often people are surprised by this Valpolicella because you expect Valpolicella potentially, certainly without the extra Classico or Ripasso denomination, to be a light, quite simple wine, and that's not really the case here. I can get my nose quite far away from the glass. Remember, we talk about putting your nose right in the glass. I don't need to do that. I'm not a long way away, but I'm just on that edge, a little bit further away than the edge than I would normally be for a medium. For those of you at level 3, that's what's pushing me just up into that medium plus. Okay. And in terms of aromas, it's kind of as we would expect, it's all primary. Okay, so for me, I'm getting the classic red cherry, a little bit of pomegranate actually. I get some bright raspberry, some slightly almost underripe raspberry, so not that kind of baked in the sun, rich jammy raspberry. So that's all coming from the Corvina and the Corvinone. And there is this lovely, delicate herbal violet character. Also, some people associate dried lavender. And again, if you're struggling to get the more delicate aromas, remember to move your nose around the glass. You know, don't always smell from the bottom of the glass. I can do my, okay? But smell from up here as well, because the volatile aromatics quite often come up here. The other thing I get from this wine is a slightly spicy note, kind of peppery, little bit herbal, and that's also the kind of an oregano character, slightly more pungent herbal note. That's coming from the Rondinella. So that tells me that there is definitely, I would expect at least 15%, if not more, of Rondinella in this wine. Okay? Because remember, the more of the percentage of a grape in a blend, the more it's going to come through in the character. And for those of you using the WSET level 3, you have to remember to comment on the development of the wine. Okay? So this is youthful. It's all primary characteristics, yeah? So this is a youthful wine. If you didn't know the vintage, by smelling it and just having those bright primary characters, that's what would be able to tip you off. So let's move on to the palate. As usual, we're going to taste in blocks. So I would like you to taste for sweetness and acidity first, okay? And remember, the acidity is how much your mouth is watering after you've tasted the wine, after you spat it out. Okay. So it's dry, no hint of sweetness in this wine whatsoever, and it's high acid. Immediately, my mouth is watering a lot, okay? My mouth is filling with moisture as a result of this wine, okay? And that's aided by the tannins, okay? Take another taste if you're not sure, but for me, the tannins on this wine sit in this low to medium minus bracket. Now, remember, you have to pick one, but I say low to medium minus because as an examiner, I would give you marks for both on this wine, okay? Because it does tend to accumulate as we go. Okay. So yes, I would give you marks for both low and medium minus tannins. But for those of you who are not sure, okay, I would taste again and try and get it in your gums, okay? This is where your true test of the tannic structure is. I often tell my students to use, that'll be the delivery, to use the wine almost like mouthwash to really get it around your gums. And this is what tells you that this is actually a medium tannin wine, okay? Medium minus for those of you working on level 3, because there is some grip, okay? There is a little bit of drying around your gums. And this is actually one of the reasons that I like demonstrating this wine, because you're getting a little bit more of that tannic structure from the Corvinone, but also from this use of cold soak. Okay, this little bit of extended time is giving you that tannic texture in the wine, which is a little unusual for a Valpolicella, but really gives a backbone to the wine along with the acidity. Okay, so we'll taste again for alcohol and body. It's quite a deceptive wine, I think, this one, because you expect it to be really light, but there's quite a lot going on. Alcohol is medium. Remember, there's no burn in the back of my throat. I don't notice it. I did check, it's 12.5. I wouldn't expect a lot of alcohol, again, because you're looking at Corvina, which doesn't accumulate a lot of sugar. Okay, certainly for a Valpolicella, one that hasn't gone through ripasso, I'm not expecting the high alcohol. Okay. And in terms of body, I would call this, again, I would give you both light and medium minus on the body of this wine as an examiner, okay? Because it's not quite water, but there's not lots and lots of texture and lots of weight in my mouth, okay? So for me, I would go light bodied, okay? But I would give you an increased, I would also give you the mark at level 3 for the medium minus, because of that tannic structure can be a little bit misleading when you're tasting the body on this wine. Okay. Flavor intensity, again, medium plus. Okay. There's a lot of flavor intensity in this wine, which, again, you often tend to think that these light colored wines are not going to have this level of intensity. Don't be fooled by the color of a wine. There can be a lot going on in the glass. And for me, it's this really bright cherry character that sticks around. It's right there on the finish. I'm going to taste again just to check that all my flavors that I found on the nose, I'm also finding on the palate, just to see if there's any disconnect. If anything, I'm losing a little bit of the floral character when I taste on the palate. The lavender is a little bit there, the kind of oregano, but I'm losing the kind of delicate violet, and it's a real focus on the cherry and this bright, fresh raspberry. And yeah, it's medium plus in intensity, and it's also medium plus in length, okay? Remember, the length is how long the positive characteristics of the wine stick around. And I still get a cherry note for a relatively long time before it's overtaken by the acid at the end. Okay? So I'm giving this medium plus on my length. So I think quite deceptive. I think you go into this wine thinking it's just going to be a really simple Valpolicella, but actually it's giving you quite a lot more. Okay? So to think about our quality and also our aging, okay? So it's balanced. Yeah, it's a very refreshing wine. The bright fruit flavor is managed by the bright acidity. There's a little bit of tannin, which helps the structure of the body. Yeah, it has intensity. Yeah, it's medium plus. Okay, it's not high, but there's intensity there. It has some degree of complexity. Yeah, because we do have both the brightness of the fruit, but also a little herbal nuance, but some. Okay? And in terms of length, yes, it has length. Yeah, it's got medium plus length. That cherry note is really deliciously sticking around. So for me, that makes it on our Blick scale very good. The thing that I wouldn't push it into outstanding for is that it could have a little bit more complexity. You know, I found 3 red fruits and maybe two other characters. That's pretty good, but that's not a huge array of things going on, despite the fact that those flavors, those 5 flavors are very intense in the wine. Okay? And in terms of aging, this is a drink now not suitable for further aging. Okay? The thing that is so great about this wine that helps it be such a very good wine is the fact that it is bright and fresh. It makes you want to reach for another glass, but it hasn't got this intense fruit concentration, this complexity that would help it age. It hasn't got the tannic backbone. Whilst it's got the acidity, those bright fresh flavors are just going to become dried, and it's going to become less refreshing. Okay. So that's my assessment of the wine. I hope those of you who are drinking it have also enjoyed it. I think this is a very good demonstration of how well Valpolicella can be made. I think certainly in the past, in the UK market, Valpolicella has had the reputation as just being this kind of like simple, uninteresting wine. And I think this wine demonstrates that that is not necessarily the case, that there is very good Valpolicella out there and it is being made. So yeah, if there are any questions, I will happily answer in the chat. You've all been very quiet and attentive today. Normally I get questions all the way through and I'm trying to catch up. I don't know if that's because you're all tired because you're back at work or if it's because you're just enjoying the wine. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Not necessarily classically Valpolicella, it does have a little bit more structure, but I think a good example of the blending of grapes for that reason and how it is demonstrated in the glass and what you can do with that. Okay, repeat about aging possibilities. Okay, so what we're looking for in a wine that is suitable for aging, because you have to think about what aging does to a wine, okay? So aging in the bottle is going to slightly reduce the acidity, okay? It's going to integrate, lessen the tannins. We call it polymerizing the tannins. This is what happens when they have contact with oxygen, okay? So it makes them softer, more silky. Okay, with this lessening of acidity, and fruit moves from fresh character to dried character in red wines. Okay, let's use red wine as an example. So this bright fresh cherry would become dried cherry. Okay, you'd have this, or plum would become prune, a grapey aroma would become raisin. Okay, and similarly with the herbs, they would become more intense, more dried. Also, the color would move from ruby to garnet. As you have oxygen contact, this is what is turning, oxidizing the colors. It's like leaving an apple out on your kitchen counter. If you've taken a slice out of it, it turns brown. It's exactly the same process. So you need to think, when you're considering your aging bracket, about whether the wine would be improved by this, okay? And this takes a little bit of getting used to with your tasting, particularly as you taste both young and older wines. I think if you tasted this wine in 5 years, you would find it a little flat. Because although you might have some drying of the fruit character, the lessening of the acidity would make it less refreshing to drink. And the tannic structure isn't there, that backbone, that kind of yeah, that kind of spine of the wine is not strong enough to support the aging of the wine. So I hope that helps. Some of it does take a little bit of getting used to in terms of tasting younger and older wines. One of the things I do in some of my tasting masterclasses in London is taste a wine that shouldn't be aged after it's been aged. And that's a really useful way of getting an indication of why you should or shouldn't age wines. The question about from Jacob, thank you for the difficult question. I knew you'd do that to me. I assume they are spraying because it's very wet at the moment. It's been a very wet spring. So I would imagine that they are spraying to try and reduce the damp, to reduce the fungus, and also to treat the vines with sulfur. I don't know what they're using. Jacopo might be able to help that. But it's just to kind of help the vines develop as best as possible, particularly with bud break and that kind of stuff happening right about now. Young shoots not susceptible to fungus, but you're trying to protect the plant long term, basically. Okay, what do I think about Gio for fruity wines? I think that's a very difficult question, probably one for a winemaker rather than an educator. However, I think one of the things that you really have to consider with your training system is your microclimate. Okay, remember we talk a lot about these issues in the Veneto with humidity. Okay, there is a reason why pergola works so well in the Veneto, because it is so wet. Particularly through the growing and ripening season. It's very, very humid in the summer coming up to harvest. You want to try and get the vines away from the ground as much as possible and get air circulation through the vines, okay? This is another advantage of pergola, okay? You get those vines up, you space them out, they're hanging down. The wind, which again is relatively strong in the Veneto, coming through the plains, can aerate the vines. I think Gio is a very good system if you are able to manage all of those other things. So if you can space your bunches out, if you can do long training, so long basal bud training, that will really help you. But yeah, that's definitely a question for a winemaker as to why you take that decision, not someone who teaches about wine and doesn't work in a vineyard. So Lee's contact. It's in sense of, when I said it's not common, I said it's, what I meant was it's not common to talk about it in red wines. Okay, you'll probably get Lee's contact in many of your red wines just because of the winemaking techniques, but we don't really talk about it. Certainly not at WSET level 2 and level 3, because it's not normally relevant. You don't normally notice it in a red wine, because you've got other things that you're looking for, the tannic structure, the acidity, the lots of different aromas that you get. Remember, Lee's aging is quite often used with more neutral grape varieties, okay? Like the Chardonnays, like Muscadel, those kind of grape varieties. The reason I wanted to draw your attention to it is because we're talking specifically about the added structure, the added texture. Okay, it's the thing for me that sort of potentially gives that possibility for you to think this wine might be medium bodied rather than light bodied. Okay, because it does just add a little something else to the wine. Okay. Massimago, and 2 kinds of Valpolicella, foothills in the north, flatter in the south. They are in the foothills, I understand. They have got slopes, but they're not very high. I believe, in fact, the grapes for their Valpolicella are only grown at 100 meters above sea level. So yes, exactly why you would get a little bit of that fruitiness. And also the acidity on Corvina is so high already that you really don't need to worry about the altitude. You know, remember with some of the white grapes, you're trying to maintain the altitude, maintain the acidity through the growing period, through the picking, to make sure that you have both full sugar ripeness, this ripeness of flavors, and this high acidity. Corvina is so high in acidity anyway that you don't really need to worry about it. I'm hoping I've caught everything. I hope that's answered everybody's questions, that you've enjoyed our virtual tasting. For next week, you know that I like to do red, white, and we're going to take a trip down south. I think all of us fancy a holiday, and since we can't get to the seas and the beaches, I'm going to take you there with a journey with wine. So we're going to do the Faudi di San Gregorio Greco di Tufo. It's also 2018. And if you're interested in talking about aging of wines, particularly white wines, this is going to be a great thing to talk about next week, and how we judge aging in white wines. Also, when wines are ready, when they're not ready, will be some of the discussion that we have next week. So I will see you then. Alice, I believe, is going to send out a notice because we're considering moving the time back a little bit to give you time to get back from work in a little bit more of a relaxed fashion. I know some people have been struggling to make it to the tasting at 6. Now things are opening up. So please watch out for the social media, for the mailing lists, for all the details. And I'll see you next week.